Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
Oh, I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. I am really fascinated by the conversation that we have coming up. It is with an author and journalist who dug into this one particular individual who was instrumental in causing the deaths of several people during the height of the opioid crisis in the early 2000s. But Tim, summoning the energy here. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. And yes, I'm very excited to introduce this conversation that we had with author Philip Isle. And his new book is called Prescription for Pain: How a Once Promising Doctor Became the Pill Mill Killer. That's a lot of ills right there. But this guy, Paul Volkman, was mentally ill to have done what he did.
And speaking of ill, this is going to be a quick intro because I don't have much of my voice left anymore after a cold has gone through my body. So thank you for that segue, Tim. And you brought up Paul Volkman. He is not just this, quote, evil character distributing these drugs to people and laughing in the corner of his dungeon in this like monstrous way. He's such a complex individual. And once Phil starts getting into his personality, his narcissism, his failures, and how all of those things kind of contributed to this one part of him that had always been there. And Phil knows this because he's got a personal connection. His father actually went to medical school with him, with Paul Volkman, and has accounts from his father saying what this man was like. But ultimately, everyone was surprised when they heard that Paul Volkman was convicted of these crimes.
Yeah, it's really a wild story and definitely a great conversation with Philip Isle. So I hope you enjoy it and make sure to check out his book. It's on Amazon and I'm sure your local bookstores as well. And you can check out more about Phil at his website. That is his name, philipisle.com.
All right, everybody, we're going to break real quick for a commercial and we'll be right back with Philip Isle and the Pill Mill Killer. And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome to the podcast, Philip Isle. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's wonderful having you. One of the highlights of what Tim and I do is when we get an email from a publicist or a publishing company and they say, hey, we have this book and this author is doing some promotion. Would you be interested? And then we look into the book and we get the copy and we read it and it's so good and we get the opportunity to speak to someone like yourself. It's tough to categorize it as true crime. I mean, it's a real cultural type story. It has crime, obviously, but the type of book that you wrote, I don't want to just paint it into the true crime corner. But anyway, can you just tell the listeners who you are and your background and what brings you to the show?
Sure. So my name is Phil Isle. I am a 39-year-old freelance journalist speaking to you from my hometown of Providence, Rhode Island. An amazing place for a journalist and somebody interested in crime to grow up. Certainly no shortage of it around here. And I've been a journalist for over a decade now. I've written for local publications and All Weekly here in Providence. I've written for national websites, magazines, and so on about a variety of subjects. But for almost my entire journalistic career, I have been following a case, a crime case that I have a somewhat of a personal connection to. When I was 23 years old, I learned that a guy who had gone to medical school with my dad was at the time indicted for a massive prescription drug dealing scheme. He was federally indicted. The DEA had investigated him and they had pointed the finger at him and said, this guy has been operating as a drug dealer for the better part of 3 years. And they said he was working out of cash-only pain clinics in southern Ohio, right near the Kentucky border, that he was prescribing tremendous amounts of opiate painkillers, as well as muscle relaxers and sedatives, and that a number of his patients over the course of this nearly 3-year period had died from apparent overdoses. My dad, just to paint a picture and to give you a sense of how shocked I was, is not the kind of guy you would expect to know somebody accused of essentially being this drug dealing kingpin. My dad is a mild-mannered, by all accounts, law-abiding endocrinologist who lives in Providence and practices in nearby Fall River. He's still going, although he's working his way toward retirement. Kind of a nerdy guy. And I was just shocked that he knew someone, albeit somebody who he had fallen out of touch with, who had found himself in this extraordinary position. It's really no joke to be be indicted by the federal government. They don't pick very many fights that they lose. The federal conviction rate is upwards of 85, maybe 90%. And these were really serious crimes. I was 23 years old. I had all of the energy and also the naivete that goes with being that young. I had just started out in journalism, and I had also recently read In Cold Blood, which was one of the books that made me want to be a writer. And so I get this idea, I'm going to see if I can find out what happened to this guy, Paul Volkman, who has an MD PhD and was charged with these crimes. And I did find out. It took me a bit longer than expected. And the result is that book, which came out earlier this year, Prescription for Pain, How a Once Promising Doctor Became the Pill Mill Killer, which, as you said, I mean, it is a crime story, but it gets into a lot of other stuff. My purpose was to tell the story of what happened to this one guy. But in order to tell that story properly and fairly and in its full context, as you both know, I had to get into a lot of other stuff. It's been a while that I've been working on this privately, and I'm just thrilled at any chance I can get to talk about it with people.
Just for clarity, how long have you been working on it? Like since then? Like obviously not straight through since then. Like
right.
Yeah.
This project really has a clear starting point, like a day where I wrote down a diary entry where I said basically, wow, I just heard about this crazy case my dad told me about. And that was March of 2009. And it also has a publication date of April 9th, 2024. So from start to finish, it is over 15 years, but you're right. I wasn't spending every day working on it. I did a lot of other things. I spent 18 months as the news editor and staff writer at my local alt-weekly newspaper, the Providence Phoenix, until that closed, where I was writing about politics and media and arts and culture. I've been a freelancer writing for a bunch of different publications about a variety of things. I've written about the Newport Jazz Festival. I've written about mental health. I've interviewed authors. And I've also been a teacher for a number of years, and I taught among other things, a class about true crime at the Rhode Island School of Design. So there were a lot of detours and stops along the way, sometimes for months or even years at the time the project would go on the shelf. There was also a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit related to the book that took over 5 years. That's a whole saga in and of itself. So yeah, I wasn't working every day of those 15 years on it, but it never really fully left my mind. And there were times, including for the last couple of years, where it was my main thing and I was just pushing it over the finish line.
And you'd mentioned that you read In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. Did you anticipate or did you desire to go as deep into something like this, the way he went into In Cold Blood? Was that something that was driving you, like you wanted to get as immersed as you possibly could?
Yes. And that didn't always go well for me. To give you an example, to probably a bad extent, I wanted to offer that kind of access. Now, I know now, as an older journalist and also as somebody who has learned more about In Cold Blood, as much as I love that book and revere it as a work of literature, I know that it's a deeply flawed work of journalism and that he cut corners and that he made up scenes and that the image that he presents of this omniscient narrator who knows everything and has access to every possible side of the story is not necessarily one that's based in journalism. You know, he took some liberties, but that idea was what I wanted to do. So for instance, on the first day of Volkman's trial in federal court in Cincinnati in early 2011, I go out there with a plan to see as many days of the trial as I can. And it's during jury selection, and there's a room filled with like 100 prospective jurors, and I'm taking notes. And at one point, one of the prospective jurors asked me who I am and starts talking to me. And we start talking during one of the breaks, and I made the critical mistake of giving this person my notebook and asking them to put their contact info in there. Because in my mind, I'm thinking if this person gets on the jury, this is going to give me the kind of like Capote-esque access that I've been dreaming of. Well, that was a huge mistake to speak to a prospective juror. And after a break in the proceedings, I got called back. The proceedings resumed and the judge called my name and basically admonished me in front of the whole courtroom, which was a mortifying experience. The lesson of which is, one, these are the kinds of situations you get yourself into if your kind of ambitions exceed your experience at that point. And also, you know, whatever access I was dreaming of, I wasn't going to get access to all parts of the story, but I did have In Cold Blood in mind.
Tell us about this Dr. Paul Volkman. You mentioned a bunch of letters before. It sounded like MVP, MD or something. What is that? And what did he do like on a day-to-day basis with his experience?
One of the things that interests me about this story is that I knew digging into Volkman's career would mean digging into my dad's career because they shared this same education. For most of my life, my dad has just been a doctor who sees patients, an MD. He's a specialist in endocrinology. Both of them were trained to be medical researchers, which is really something different from the doctor in the white coat with the stethoscope that we all kind of picture. MD PhDs really are the guys and women who are working in laboratories, who are getting grants to study diseases, to look for cures, to look for new treatments. They're really not necessarily supposed to be patient-facing doctors. They're supposed to be working at universities, publishing research, and these are the folks, the scientists, medical scientists, who are kind of pushing the body of medical knowledge forward. So that was what Volkman and my dad both trained to do. They both wound up leaving that and going into private practice. Volkman had an odd career. Back to the qualification thing, you go to extra school to be an MD, PhD. It's like 6 years of school. It's more than just an MD. And it's really the highest level of qualification almost anybody can have in our society. You're a doctor basically times two. So that always fascinated me, this idea of this guy wasn't just an MD. He had a PhD, and his PhD was in the subject of pharmacology, which was basically the science of medications. So that like high level of expertise and the kind of sordid crimes he was accused of fascinated me. So Volkman had an odd career. He went into research and then kind of flamed out for reasons that he says were one thing and other people say were another, which is a pattern in his career and in his life. He then goes into pediatrics, which doesn't quite work out. It isn't a very lucrative specialty. Many people said he wasn't a good personality for it, given that he wasn't really the touchy-feely, warm and cuddly type. He finds that pediatrics isn't kind of making the kind of money he hoped and expected. At this point, he's married. He has 2 small kids. He's living in Chicago. So he starts at some point early on moonlighting in emergency rooms, first on nights and weekends. And then he starts taking trips around the Midwest, taking up temporary ER gigs for days, weeks at a time. These are called locum tenens jobs, which is kind of a fancy name for temp work for doctors. And for about 20 years, he balances between pediatrics on one hand and this kind of life of an roving temporary emergency room doctor. And in those 20 years, he's sued for malpractice a number of times. And those malpractice cases wound up being critical to what would later happen. Like virtually everything in his life and career, Volkman claims that these malpractice lawsuits were unfair, that there wasn't any merit to them, that these were predatory lawyers coming after him, and that there was no negligence. In my research, I was certainly interested in that. There were 2 jury trials for malpractice cases that were decided against him. There were an additional 2 cases that were settled by his insurers. By the time the early 2000s roll around, he winds up becoming uninsurable. Medical malpractice insurers, which you really need to practice any kind of medicine, decide that this guy isn't worth insuring. And he finds himself backed into a corner, basically. He's living on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, really posh part of town, paying upwards of $4,000 a month in rent. He's got bills to pay, a family to support, and his options for working as a doctor are severely diminished. And that is when he answers an online ad for a pain clinic in Southern Ohio where malpractice insurance was not required. And where, as it turns out, he would be expected to prescribe lots and lots of pills, which is what he proceeded to do for the next few years. So I didn't really know any of this. I didn't know Paul Volkman at all before my dad mentioned him. So I really dug into his story to find out what the crimes were, but also all the events that preceded them. So that's all laid out in the book.
And you had mentioned that he wasn't a warm and fuzzy type guy, and there's some really great quotes of your father saying that he was a bit of a downer. He had a lot of bitterness, and I feel like a lot of that bitterness drove him to make these excuses for why certain things didn't work out in his life. And it was always from this place of bitterness and resentment. Can you elaborate on that? Where did that resentment come from? Was that instilled in him as a kid?
That's a really good question. I think that this book wound up being 400 pages, and I think it would have been a lot shorter of a book if I had found that, like some of the other doctor gone bad cases of the opiate epidemic, this was a simple case of a guy who had a drinking problem or had a drug problem or who was gambling or who was trading pills for sex. But I didn't find evidence of any of that. I found the book became a personality profile. And so the questions you're asking, what drove this guy, who by the time I met him after his indictment was extraordinarily cynical, believed himself to be a victim throughout his life, not just in his legal case, but certainly in his legal case, was quite bright and articulate, but also prone to grandiose statements about himself, had a big ego. I wish, for as much research as I did, the early years of Volkman's life remain a bit of a mystery. And the question of, was it nature, was it nurture that made this guy who he was, remains to an extent unanswered. I don't have a good answer to that. I did learn about his only sibling, a brother, and I go on kind of a digression in the book to talk about this brother, who, according to that brother's only son, also had an extremely, let's say, difficult personality and was an extraordinarily difficult guy to get along with from a father-son perspective, and basically had a lot of mental issues. So I did come away thinking that whatever happened to both of them to some extent. Both brothers wound up being two really kind of screwed up guys. But I will also say that, when I spoke to people like my dad and other classmates from med school, they did remember a guy who was bitter, who was a bit of a complainer, a pessimist. But nobody from that time said, oh, we think this guy is going to turn into a criminal. Everyone was totally shocked by what happened to him. Nobody expected, Paul Volkman to wind up in federal prison. In fact, one of the quotes from a guy who knew him at the time, this guy told me, I thought I would open the paper one day and see that Paul had been given the Nobel Prize. So he struck some people as very promising. So, I try my best to kind of portray his psychology in the book in terms of describing it. But how it happened exactly is still a bit of a mystery to me.
Is there a when, like some point in time where he was on a better trajectory and then he kind of broke bad?
That's also a question I was interested in. I mean, if you look at just what prosecutors say, the indictment starts with his activity in Ohio. As far as I know, although he had faced malpractice charges, he hadn't faced criminal charges before that. So from a legal perspective, prosecutors say he broke bad the minute he arrived in Southern Ohio and started working at this sketchy cash-only pain clinic, which, by the way, was owned and operated and founded by a local woman down there who didn't have any medical background, didn't have a college degree, had worked in fast food restaurants and factories, and had decided that she was going to open up a pain clinic. So that's the kind of operation we're talking about here. But I think a more nuanced answer to your question is, I was, of course, interested in when did this guy go bad. I'd say it might start with the first malpractice lawsuit in the late 1980s, which is horrifying case, stemmed from his time as a pediatrician when parents brought in their 1-year-old child to his office. The child hadn't slept well the night before. After arriving at the office, the child developed some really severe, life-threatening breathing issues, a condition called epiglottitis, where the kind of windpipes swells up and can potentially close. And Volkman made the critical and much criticized decision not to allow this child to be transported to a local hospital for treatment. He believed that this girl's condition was so dire and he had the expertise that he was going to intubate, as in put a tube into this child's windpipe, the child in the office, and he blames faulty equipment for the reason things went south. The child would die a few days later, and a lawsuit would be brought against Volkman and some of the EMTs from the city of Chicago. Do I think this is what broke Volkman bad? I don't know, but I say in the book that it's an example of some really reckless behavior, some really dangerous behavior, some really egotistical and belligerent behavior that clearly put somebody's life at risk. that he would, in response, claim to be a total... He wouldn't just say he was innocent, he would say he was actually heroic, which is mind-boggling if you consider the outcome. So I'd say whatever dark path he was on started, at the very least, in the late 80s in his pediatrics office, although the real criminal activity wouldn't start for another 15 years.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Can you tell us a bit about his work in medical research? Because you do a little bit of definition on medical research, and he did some research into strokes as well.
So just as a side note, shortly after I heard about Volkman's case, I was about to enter a graduate writing program. Volkman was out of prison following his initial indictment and awaiting trial. And I reached out to him to see if he would be up for an interview. And somewhat to my surprise, he was. So in my first Christmas break from graduate school, about 9 months after learning about Volkman, I drove out to Chicago, and we had the first of a series of in-person interviews where I was recording with his permission. And I got a total of 15 hours of those interviews recorded before his trial, and then we continued to correspond for many years after his trial. So all of that is a lead up to me saying, when it comes to Volkman's side of the story, I have that in abundance. And I draw on that at many times in the book. So when it comes to his research, when it comes to anything, there's what Paul Volkman says, and then there's what I could learn from available documents or from other people. Volkman claims he does have a handful of named off as an author papers that were published in the late 70s. It's not as many as, for instance, his classmates in the MD PhD program who went on to have, careers, including my dad, where they continued to publish for years after the program, even decades. And their published work goes on for pages in their CV. Volkman's are much shorter. Volkman claims that in his medical research, he discovered a basically revolutionary treatment for a certain kind of stroke. And he claims that this was a brilliant solution that he was ready to have published in one of the leading journals in the field. And with the catch was that the director of the lab where he was working, who would need to sign off on whatever his research was, Volkman claims this guy was away on vacation, came back, didn't agree with Volkman's methods or something, and for unclear reasons, didn't allow Volkman to publish this world-changing research. And thus, according to Paul, he soured on medical research in general and left. Dramatic story, right? Well, I tracked down the lab director who barely remembered Volkman. He didn't remember him as the brilliant researcher that he claimed to be. He literally told me if this guy hadn't spoken up, he would have blended in with the wallpaper. And this guy remembered no such revolutionary research. He remembered Volkman as a not particularly distinguished researcher who was interested in doing a lot of moonlighting on the side, working in local emergency rooms to make ends meet. And that, he said, was the reason why they ultimately parted ways. When you ask about Volkman's career as a researcher, it depends who you ask. If you ask him, he was a brilliant researcher thwarted by this jerk of a boss. If you ask the boss, he was a totally forgettable guy who didn't really bring his best self to work because he was distracted and eventually left. As I do many times in the book, I present both of those things and we keep on going. And as readers will see, there's a pattern where Volkman says one thing, that he's extraordinary or a victim or both, and other people say, no, that's not really what happened.
Wow, so you spent a lot of time with him. Does he have like a serial killer type coldness to him?
Yes and no, I would say. He's not the kind of guy who, if you're hanging out with him, would necessarily give you the willies. He kind of appears to be, or appeared in past tense, he plays bridge, he plays chess, he likes classical music, he likes going to the local art museums. He was living the life of a kind of what seemed to be kind of a highly educated, retired guy, even though the reasons for his retirement was that he was under federal indictment. So if you were to just talk to him for a minute, you may not get a negative impression of him. And he could certainly hold a conversation about politics or medicine, and he appears quite bright. And I did, in fact, interview a number of people who knew him from Chicago, who were mostly taken in by his story and did believe he was wrongfully accused. But he will say things, or he will write things later on that are indeed quite creepy. I mean, he will show flashes of a really hot temper that he sometimes aimed at me, called me stupid, said I was going to wind up in prison for the way I was researching the story, called me corrupt, called me brainwashed. I mean, one example that sticks in my mind is when, after he was convicted, he was in county prison, and he described reading the pre-sentencing recommendations from his parole officer, which recommended 4 consecutive life sentences. And he said, and I don't think he was joking, he thought he might strangle this person and earn one of the life sentences. So whether that was a dark joke or a real thing that he meant, or either one, disturbing, right? He would say things like he had a drug testing regime in his clinics, which he claimed was the way he made sure that the patients were taking what he prescribed. This was an area where drug diversion was rampant and where he should have known that people were either selling their pills or abusing them. But he had these blood tests, which were not even really an established thing at the time or even now, these blood tests that he claimed could measure the amount of a medication in their system. And he basically told me that if people died when they were trying to kind of game the test in order to lie and make it look like they were taking the pills, that was on them, not him. And they died in the process of trying to screw him over. And therefore, he felt they kind of deserved what they got. So these are the kind of things that you wouldn't want to hear anyone say, let alone a doctor who was entrusted with caring for people who have really serious illnesses. So, Tim, to answer your question, the answer is kind of both. He could appear normal-ish, but he could also say some really disturbing things. He's also the kind of guy who at his own sentencing hearing called the judge a heinous criminal. So he's an unusual guy.
Getting to the real nitty-gritty of this story, he answers an ad that is placed for a pain center in Ohio. And there's no regulations, right? So or limited regulations. So this is an opportunity for him. Can you break down the process here? How does he get there? How does he relocate? And when does he start to really, dig in and see the results of the process that he's doing there?
Well, he doesn't relocate. One of the, again, many extraordinary things about this case is that he lived in Chicago and he worked during the week in Portsmouth, Ohio, which is about 400 miles away. And he would commute on a weekly basis for almost 3 years, which is, again, unusual and odd, and may have had side benefits like the fact that the office where he was working wasn't a place where his family or his friends could just swing by and see what was going on. Or, the anger that was starting to, or the heat from law enforcement that was following him down in Ohio didn't necessarily follow him back to Chicago, at least for a certain period of time. So he begins this unusual commute. He's going down on a weekly basis. Interestingly, from one of the poshest parts of one of the biggest cities in the country to this forgotten Rust Belt Appalachian town that's really down on its luck. I mean, one of the things that interested me about this story is that it brings these kind of two poles, different versions of American life into kind of conversation with each other. And he starts working at this clinic. And if you believe the testimony at his trial from pharmacists, 6 or 7 of whom testified, problems started basically immediately upon his arrival. Local pharmacies were so alarmed by the scripts he was writing for opiate painkillers, for sedatives like Valium, for muscle relaxers like Soma. They were disturbed by the amounts he was writing, by the fact that the patients didn't appear to be in pain, that the patients were coming in groups, that the patients were paying in cash without batting an eye. That one by one, local pharmacists in Southern Ohio said, or even in Kentucky, West Virginia nearby, we're not going to fill this guy's scripts. So that posed a problem because within a few months of his arrival, this pain clinic, which was at that point reliant on pharmacies to fill the prescriptions, and the pain clinic, by their own admission, 90% of the care they offered was prescriptions, as opposed to physical therapy or injections or other kinds of treatment. And so they did something that in hindsight seems kind of nuts. They successfully applied for permission from the Ohio Pharmacy Board to have an on-site dispensary, meaning their clinic within about 5 months of Volkman's arrival became a one-stop shop where Volkman's patients could see the doctor, receive their prescriptions, walk down a hallway, and have those same prescriptions filled at the cash-only on-site pharmacy. And that was the model that they, and the pharmacy, mind you, was run by the same family that had founded the clinic, basically the woman's daughter. She also didn't have any specialized medical training. She wasn't a pharmacist. Details about this whole operation came out in the trial, which were extraordinary. Access to the back end of the pharmacy, which of course had these wildly valuable and dangerous medications, was super lax. A lot of different family members and employees had access. And people from the clinic also testified that Volkman was treating a number of the employees and owner of the clinic as patients. So like pretty much her whole family that owned the clinic and ran the clinic were also patients of the doctor. So it was just really sketchy stuff. But this is how the clinic operated for, 2 some odd years, and business was very good. They brought in a lot of cash, but it was also wrought a lot of damage on the community, and a number of patients died from apparent overdoses.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing statement that's made on the whole crisis with the prescription meds and that particular section in this country, and how it wasn't just a isolated incident. I have 2 quick questions. Maybe not quick, but how did he make the money? Was there like a kickback from the prescription drug manufacturers? And also, how are multiple people who aren't licensed to do this able to do this? They're not pharmacists, they're not doctors, nurses, anything. Like, how is that possible?
I'll answer the second question first, which is in the course of the 15 years I worked on this book, at the city level and at the state level in Ohio, when this problem really got out of control, especially of these so-called pill mills, city councils and the state legislature rushed to close some of the loopholes that clinics like Volkman's had been exploiting. Among them, one was that you needed to be a doctor to own a clinic like this, or clinics like this needed to be affiliated with a local hospital or university, or clinics like this needed to be subject to, random inspections by the local health department. So a lot of these loopholes got closed, and a clinic like Tri-State Healthcare that I wrote about could not open or operate now in the town of Portsmouth in 2024 in the way it did in 2003. Did it take too long? Should they have known earlier? That's another question that I would leave to other people. The question of how Volkman was making money, there's kind of 2 answers to that. For the first 2.5 years of his nearly 3-year tenure down there, he was a salaried employee of Tri-State Healthcare. And as far as I could tell, he didn't make any additional money aside from his pretty significant weekly salary of, I think, started at $5,000, then became $5,500 a week. And Volkman claims disingenuously and dishonestly that because he was on a salary, he, quote, never made any money from drug dealing, which is nonsense, because he would not have remained employed there if he had put his foot down and said, I'm not going to write these scripts that are obviously keeping the clinic going. And there had been doctors before him who had been hired by the clinic who did that, and they didn't last. Also, that doesn't take into account Volkman's extreme professional desperation to find any kind of work and to maintain his really high standard of living, most exemplified by this $4,500 a month Lakeshore Drive apartment in Chicago. He said something to me, which I don't know if he realized how incriminating it was, that between the time he became uninsurable for malpractice insurance and finding this pain clinic job, he was so desperate for work that he spent some amount of time chopping vegetables in a restaurant kitchen. So this was a guy with an MD PhD who was so down on his luck that he was reduced to kind of minimum wage type work and then going home surely infuriated to his Lakeshore Drive apartment. I mean, it depends on how you look at it. I think $5,000 a week is a lot of money, but it didn't add up necessarily to millions. Over the course of this entire period, working at Tri-State, Volkman made something like $650,000 over 2.5 years. A lot of money, without a doubt, not as much money as you might imagine. he was all out of options and unwilling to voluntarily lower his standard of living. Now, after he split up with Denise Huffman, the owner of the clinic, he went out on his own for a few months, and at that point ran his own clinics. And at those clinics, he was no longer making a salary. He was just making whatever he kept after paying expenses. And he proudly said to me at one point he was on pace to make $1 million or $1.5 million the year he was shut down. So that's how he was making money, first as a salaried employee and then as the owner of his own clinics.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
So how many people do you think he was responsible for, killing or helping to kill?
The language there, you're right to ask, what is the language, helping kill? Another thing that I found interesting about this case is, if you believe Paul Volkman, he claims he didn't cause any deaths, literally zero. That if people died, it was because they weren't taking drugs according to his directions, or they were taking them with other substances that they didn't tell him about, or they died of things like heart disease or other things that weren't his fault. And he claims that these people were really sick or in pain to begin with. I know from DEA folks who worked on the case that they apparently looked into as many as more than 30 deaths from this time period. They wound up having enough information, evidence to charge him with connections to 14 patient deaths. They didn't charge him with murder or manslaughter. They charged him with illegal prescription drug dealing with death or injury resulting. So there are 14 people named in the indictment. And then later, the jury in his trial, his 8-week trial in Cincinnati, another thing that makes this case stick out is Volkman, unlike the majority of federal defendants generally, or doctors specifically, refused to accept a plea deal. And so there wound up being a trial with 80 witnesses, and it turned into a 4,000-page transcript, which was enormously helpful to me. The jury found him guilty of dealing drugs to the majority of those 14 people, and in each case, they had the option of holding him directly responsible for a patient's death. They chose that in 4 instances. So the jury ultimately convicted him of causing the death of 4 patients, and the judge wound up giving him a life sentence for each one of those patient deaths and ordered him to serve them consecutively. So that's where you have this extraordinary sentence of 4 consecutive life terms. But really the answer of how many deaths did he cause, there's a lot of different answers, from as many as upwards of 30 to 0 if you ask him, to somewhere in the middle if you follow the details of the case. I will say that among the family members of those 14 people, who I sought out to speak to as many as I could, none of them were sympathetic to Volkman. None of them believed that this guy was a legitimate doctor. And they virtually all blamed him to some extent for their family member's death.
Are any of these cases going to be escalated to the manufacturers of these pain medications?
That's an interesting question. This is a book about one doctor who was charged and convicted of prescription drug dealing. The best I can tell, there were dozens, if not a couple hundred, doctors charged and convicted of prescription drug dealing in the course of the opiate epidemic. You guys are in Massachusetts. There have been cases in Mass. There have been cases in Rhode Island, where I am. Been a ton of cases in Ohio and Kentucky and Florida. There have been cases in almost every state in the country. But I do find it interesting that if you zoom out and ask Lance the completely logical and rational question of, is anyone else facing criminal charges? You see very few criminal cases. You see a ton of civil cases. It's one of the most complex civil cases in American history, that relates to pharmacies and distributors and pharmaceutical companies, Purdue, and on and on and on, paying these enormous amounts. But as far as criminal cases go, you can kind of count the number of non-doctor cases on maybe 2 hands. There was one pharmaceutical company actually based out of Massachusetts, Insys, that's been the subject of a couple books, or a book and some TV shows. I think there was maybe one distributor that faced criminal charges. Purdue early on faced some criminal charges, but nobody went to jail. In that sense, the answer is kind of no. And I think it's really worth asking why. And it's worth looking at things like the financial crisis, these massive white collar messes for which very few of the people most responsible faced criminal charges. I mean, on one hand, doctors being charged for drug dealing is white collar crime. But if you look at it in the scope of the prescription drug epidemic, doctors are pretty low in the chain. And they certainly deserve to be held to account. But I think people higher up ought to be held to account as well. And we haven't really seen that.
That is unfortunate. Do you think that that's because it's just too much of a beast to try to take down?
Yeah, I think it's complicated. As complex as a case like Volkman's was, where prosecutors had to prove that this guy was dealing drugs and not treating pain, which hinged on words like legitimate, like was this in the course of legitimate medical practice. I think it's even harder to prove that a distributor that's making a lot of money, moving drugs from pharmaceutical companies to pharmacies is operating in a criminal way, or that a pharmaceutical company that's maybe making cash, bundles of cash is doing so in a criminal manner. I think it is hard, but I think we ought to try, There's also the fact that these companies have a ton of influence. They have basically bottomless amounts of money, or at least did at one point. Purdue's kind of been stripped clean. And they have lobbyists and connections and revolving doors and federal agencies and all the things that go with that. To that, I would just point to the bigger question of how often do we really prosecute corporate crime in this country? And it's not a lot. And the opiate epidemic is part of that.
And what can we learn from all of this? What's the takeaway? It does have some closure with him being convicted and incarcerated. What's the larger, I don't want to say moral we can take from it, but what do we learn? On
one hand, and I'm not going to cop out entirely and say that's up to the readers, I'm eager to put this book in front of lawyers and doctors and nurses and pharmacists and people in Ohio and people at the University of Chicago where Volkman went to school, because I do think different people are going to bring different things to this story. In fact, people who are suffering with chronic pain or have loved ones might bring a certain skepticism to the story. They might be more inclined to believe Volkman. So there's that. I would leave it up to different people, and that's why I'm so eager to bring this book to different audiences. However, I will say this. The opiate epidemic, which as we talked about is still ongoing. I was looking at statistics for Massachusetts the other day for a story I'm writing. More than 2,000 people died from apparent opiate overdoses in 2023. It's like 5 people a day. It's just astonishing, horrifying. And that's going on to some extent around the country. And this was not a natural disaster. This was a man-made crisis. And as a man-made crisis, we ought to take a very close look at all of the different ways it happened. And it is a huge story. This book is one of just maybe 10, 12, 15 books about the opiate epidemic, because there's so much to get into at the state level, at the federal level, at the academia level, regulatory level. So this book tells the story of a particular guy. It tells also the story of, I think, a moment where regulations were kind of lax. I mean, some of the lessons that could be learned from this book had maybe already been acted on by the time the book came out, of the kind I'm describing about, like in the town of Portsmouth, Ohio, or in the state of Ohio, where these clinics can't operate anymore. Like, some of those lessons have already been learned, and that's good. But this is also, I think, a bigger story. The opiate epidemic was a moment when a lot of different people and companies took this proposition that nobody could really argue with in principle, that we ought to treat pain and we ought to relieve suffering and we ought to help people get their lives back. They took this kind of unimpeachable idea and they found that there was a lot of money to be made there and a lot of downstream consequences that they weren't upfront about or didn't care about. And so it was a moment when people made a lot of money wrapping themselves in the cloak of goodness. And Paul Volkman will still claim that he's a good guy and a good doctor, but they caused a lot of damage in the process. I will also say, without getting too political, this book is a case study in a certain kind of, let's say, malignant narcissism and the damage that can cause in a medical context. But I think we're seeing what happens when that kind of personality is unleashed in a political context as well. I don't harp too much in the book about the rather striking psychological parallels between Paul Volkman and a certain former president, but I think they're there for people to see. So it's also, I think, a cautionary tale about what happens when people with no remorse, minimal introspection, minimal empathy, a severe victim mentality and power, what happens when those people kind of go unchecked? Those, I guess, would be a few morals to take away.
Yeah, well said there, because there is that whole like doubling down on it's the wrong thing to do, but I'm telling you this is the right thing to do. And you double down on it because your ego isn't in check. And when you put all of those ingredients together in that recipe you just gave us, yeah, it is malignant and toxic.
At a basic level, this is a book about abuse of power. To be a doctor with a prescribing pad in any context is a form of power. To be there in this really down and out part of Ohio where these drugs he's prescribing are highly addictive and also highly lucrative on the street, and where jobs are really hard to come by, this is an enormous amount of power. These people were extremely vulnerable for so many reasons, and Volkman abused that power. So I think those stories are always going to be worth telling for people in the medical world and elsewhere.
Well, congratulations on the book. It's really a great accomplishment. Where can we get the book and follow your work?
Well, thank you so much, Tim and Lance. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you guys about this, and I so appreciate the kind words about the book and these excellent questions. The book, thanks to my wonderful publisher, the New England-based independent Steerforth Press, got to give them a shout out, they're up in New Hampshire, is wonderfully distributed. So it's basically available wherever you get books. It's certainly at all the big guys online, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, but it's also available at most indie bookshops. And if they don't have it on their shelves already, you can ask them for it. I've also been delighted to see how many libraries are carrying the book. I'm a huge public library guy. So if your library doesn't have it already, you can go and ask that they order it and maybe refer them to this podcast to show them why they should order it. It's also, it's on e-readers and there's an audio version. So really, however you want to consume the book, shy of a movie or TV adaptation, which who knows, maybe someday down the road we'll have that. The book is available and people can follow me on, I'm on pretty much every social network. I'm most active on Twitter and X at Phil Isle. I'm also on Instagram. I'm on TikTok, mostly cat videos. I'm on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn, anywhere they can find me. And they can also email me. And, this book came out 4 months ago, but I'm excited that I still have a number of events coming up, both in my own state of Rhode Island, and I'm going to be going back out to Ohio and Kentucky and West Virginia in the fall to have some events really in the area where this story takes place. So I'm really excited to continue telling people about it.
And do you have another story you're working on after this?
I do. I don't have I don't have a book contract yet, but I mentioned that I got involved in a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit for evidence from Volkman's trial that wasn't being released to me, like thousands of pages of evidence. Wound up suing the DEA, winning, but it took years. In that process, I got really interested in the Freedom of Information Act. And I learned that nobody's really written like a general audience, colorful, engaging history of that law, talking about things like John Lennon's FBI file and torture at Guantanamo Bay that we learn about through FOIA requests and all kinds of other, UFOs and Area 51. Hopefully I will be coming back up for air at some point with a book about the FOIA to tell you guys about.
Yeah, definitely. You're more than welcome to come back on the show to talk about that, because FOIA is part of what we do here. Some, background research for certain cases, but we have a lot of our listeners asking about that as well. So once you have that ready to go, let us know, and you're more than welcome to come back on.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited about it. It'll be a little change of pace from true crime. I would like to write another true crime book at some point. I think I need a bit of a breather. I have this personal connection to and passion about the FOIA as a result of this multi-year lawsuit I had. And I think there's a really remarkable and important story to tell there. So that's what I'm eager to do next.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you for having me, guys. I appreciate it.